I am a civil engineer. For 31 years in Portland, Oregon, I specialized in failure analysis and structural integrity. My entire professional life has been dedicated to the study of how things break. I know how to calculate the exact moment a steel beam gives way under concentrated stress, and I know that the most lethal cracks are the ones that start deep in the foundation, invisible to the naked eye, until the entire structure begins to groan under its own weight. In my world, there is no room for hope, luck, or intent. There is only load-bearing capacity, torque, shear force, and the immutable laws of physics. If a bridge fails, it's because someone ignored the data. If a building collapses, it's because the materials were compromised. I spent 3 decades ensuring that the bridges people crossed and the buildings they slept in were safe. I applied that same rigorous, cold discipline to my own home. I thought 38 years of marriage to Margaret and a lifetime of providing for my son, Daniel, had created a structure that was earthquake-proof. I believed our life was a fortress of stability. I was wrong. I didn't realize that while I was out inspecting the city's concrete and steel, a parasite had moved into my own basement, eating away at the supports until the whole thing was held up by nothing but habit, memory, and a layer of thinning paint. The vulnerability. Margaret is 61. She is the softest component of my world, the padding that made my rigid, analytical life bearable. She is the kind of woman who apologizes to the furniture if she accidentally bumps into it. She has a mild heart condition, an arrhythmia that her cardiologist monitors with the precision of a clockmaker. It's not a death sentence, but it makes her fragile. It makes her susceptible to shocks. A year ago, she stopped driving because the aggressive Portland traffic made her hands shake on the wheel. She became a prisoner of her own gentleness, restricted to the 4 walls of the house we built together. That was exactly what Daniel needed. He didn't see a mother in need of protection. He saw a soft target with a high liquid net worth and a heart that couldn't handle a fight. Our son. Our greatest achievement. He moved back in March of last year after his life in Seattle turned into a smoking crater. He told us it was a corporate downsizing and a mutually agreed-upon divorce. Margaret welcomed him with open arms, tears of joy, and enough home-cooked meals to fill a warehouse. I stayed quiet. I'm an engineer. I saw the telltale signs of a man who hadn't just tripped, but had jumped off a ledge and was looking for someone to break his fall. But I loved my wife and my wife loved her son. So, I allowed the unauthorized load into the building. I ignored the red flags. That was my first and most significant structural failure. The deformation. By May, the atmospheric pressure in the house began to shift. It wasn't something you could see but something you could feel, a drop in the oxygen levels. I'd come home from a consulting gig and find Margaret absent. She wasn't just tired, she looked like a building that had been gutted from the inside, leaving only the facade standing by sheer luck. Her laughter, once frequent and light, had been replaced by a heavy, watchful silence. In June, the communication lines started failing. Her sister Ruth, who usually talked to her 3 times a week, called my cell phone in a panic. "Gary, I can't get through to the house. The line is always busy or it just rings out. Is she okay?" I checked the house phone. The call logs had been wiped. The voicemail inbox, usually full of Ruth's rambling messages, was empty. When I asked Margaret about it, she looked at the floor and said she must have forgotten how to use the machine. Her eyes were darting toward the hallway, toward Daniel's room. In August, the load became unbearable. Margaret asked me, with a tremor in her voice that made my blood run cold, if we were liquidating the retirement fund. "Daniel said the market is a bloodbath, Gary," she whispered, her hands twisting her apron. "He said if we don't move the money to a private, secure account he found, something protected from the bank's hidden fees, we'll be eating cat food by Christmas. He said you were too proud to admit we're losing everything." That was the moment the alarms went off in my head. He wasn't just stealing, he was gaslighting. He was using my own reputation as a precision-oriented man against me, telling my wife I was failing so he could step in as the savior. The forensic audit. I didn't get angry. Anger is a waste of kinetic energy. I went to work. I have a security system installed, 4 high-definition cameras with 24/7 cloud storage and motion sensors. I hadn't checked the archives in months because I trusted the inhabitants of my home. That night, I waited until the house was dark. I sat in my office with a glass of neat scotch and my laptop. I didn't look at the footage as a father or a husband. I looked at it as a forensic investigator performing a post-collapse audit. Log entry, Wednesday, July 14th, 11:15 a.m. I'm at a client meeting in Beaverton. On the screen, Margaret is in her green armchair. Daniel walks in. He isn't the charming salesman here. The mask is off. He drops a stack of legal documents on her lap, papers he'd printed from my own office. I watch Margaret shake her head. She's trying to be firm. Daniel doesn't hit her. He doesn't have to. He leans over her, caging her in the chair, his face inches from hers. I see the cords in his neck straining. He is barking at her, a rhythmic, relentless verbal assault. He stays there for 20 minutes, looming like a shadow, until she is physically trembling, her hands over her ears. When he finally leaves, he takes the papers with a smirk of pure, chilling satisfaction. Margaret doesn't move for 2 hours. She just stares at the door, paralyzed. Log entry, Monday, June 21st, 2:30 p.m. The kitchen. Daniel has a laptop open. He's pointing at the screen, then at her. He's trying to get her to authorize an e-transfer from our joint savings. She pushes the laptop away. He grabs her wrist. Not enough to break the skin, but with the specific torque needed to inflict pain and demand compliance. He forces her hand onto the trackpad. I watched my son, the boy I'd spent 34 years protecting, treat his mother like a stubborn piece of hardware he was trying to hack. I watched footage until the sun came up, documenting every incident in a spreadsheet. I saw him intercepting the mail, pocketing bank statements before I could see them. I saw him deleting messages on the house phone. I saw him standing in the garage, screaming into his cell phone at some private lender, his voice high and desperate, promising them that the old man is losing his grip and the house deed is as good as theirs. He wasn't a son in trouble. He was a demolition crew. The counterload. I spent the next week building my counterstrike. I didn't just want him out, I wanted him neutralized. I visited our bank. Patricia, the manager, had known us for 20 years. When I asked for the internal logs, her face softened into something like pity. Gary, I wanted to call you. Daniel brought Margaret in twice. Both times she looked distressed. That's the word the teller used in the report. He tried to get himself added as a co-signatory. He told the teller you were undergoing neurological testing and couldn't manage the accounts anymore. Since Margaret wouldn't confirm it and your signature wasn't there, we blocked it. But he was insistent. Insistent. A polite word for a predator trying to claw through a vault door. I consulted an estate attorney, a woman who specialized in elder law. I didn't give her a sob story. I handed her a thumb drive with 12 gigabytes of video evidence and a 47-page binder of bank records, text logs, and a timeline of events. Gary, she said, looking over the specs. This is clinical. It's a textbook case of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. You have enough here to not only get a restraining order but to pursue criminal charges. He was aiming for the deed, Gary. He was going to sell the house out from under you while you were at work. On Sunday morning, while Daniel was at the gym, likely spending the last of the cash he'd managed to gilt out of Margaret's emergency stash, I sat my wife down at the kitchen table. I took her hands in mine. They were as cold as rebar in midwinter. Margaret, I've seen the tapes. I've been to the bank. I've talked to Patricia. I know about the private lenders and the threats. She broke. The dam that had been holding back months of terror finally gave way. She told me the details I couldn't see on camera. How he told her he'd be erased by these men if the money didn't show up. How he told her I was declining, and that if I found out, the stress would cause me a fatal stroke, so her silence was the only thing keeping me alive. He had weaponized her love for both of us, turning her own heart into a cage. I thought he would stop, she sobbed into my chest. I thought if I just gave him a little more time, he'd become my Danny again. I didn't want to lose my son, Gary. He's not Danny anymore, Margaret, I said, my voice as flat and unyielding as a slab of granite. He's a structural defect. And I am going to remove him before he brings the whole house down. The collapse. Daniel came home at noon, radiating that false high-energy confidence of a salesman who thinks he's about to close the deal. He walked into the living room, probably ready to pitch another urgent reason why Margaret needed to sign a power of attorney. He saw me sitting there. I wasn't reading. I wasn't watching the news. I had the 47-page binder on the coffee table, and my laptop was open, looping the footage of him grabbing Margaret's wrist in the kitchen. Dad? What's with the war room setup? You look like you're ready to testify before Congress, he joked, though I saw his eyes immediately lock onto the laptop screen. I saw his pupils dilate. The salesman was starting to realize the market had crashed. Sit down, Daniel, I said. My voice was a low-frequency hum, the kind of sound a bridge makes right before a cable snaps. I've performed a stress test on your story. It failed. Every single pillar of your life in this house is about to be demolished. I didn't let him speak. I walked him through the binder. Page by page. The unauthorized bank visits. The neurological testing lie. The garage phone calls to his lenders. The footage of him looming over his mother like a common thug. You have 2 hours to pack a single bag, I said, checking my watch. At 3 p.m. I am calling the police. I have a direct line to a detective Frank knows. I am handing over this binder, the thumb drive, and a signed statement from your mother. If you are still on my property, you will be leaving in handcuffs. He tried to bluff. He tried the gaslight one last time. Dad, you're losing it. This is elder abuse. You're paranoid, you're trapping Mom. Mom, tell him. Tell him he's crazy. Margaret didn't look at him. She didn't say a word. She just sat there, her hand over her heart, looking at the floor. 3 o'clock, Daniel, I said. The police report is already drafted. It's just waiting for a timestamp. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. He called me things I won't repeat. He told me he hated the mechanical, cold bastard I'd always been. He told me the lenders would come for the house anyway, because he'd already given them our address as collateral. Let them come, I said. I've lived in this city for 63 years. I know every contractor, every cop, and every structural engineer in the Tri-County area. I've reinforced the perimeter. You, however, are officially condemned. He left at 2:45 p.m. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't look back. He just threw his bag into his trunk and sped off, leaving 2 black streaks of rubber on the driveway I'd spent 30 years keeping clean. The house is quiet now. A heavy, artificial quiet. Frank is coming over later with a locksmith to change every entry point and install a new, unhackable security hub. Margaret is upstairs, resting under a doctor's supervision. I am an engineer. I know that after a catastrophic failure, you have to clear the debris down to the bedrock before you can even think about rebuilding. I've cleared the debris. I've removed the defective material. But as I sit here in the silence, looking at the empty space where my son used to be, I realize that some foundations are so badly cracked that you can never truly call them home again. I'm 63 years old, and I've just realized that I spent my life building bridges for everyone else, while the one in my own backyard was made of paper. The hardest project of my life hasn't ended. It's just moved into the demolition phase. I get it. No titles, no chapter markers, just the raw, unbroken narrative for the narration. We're going deeper into the technical retaliation and the psychological war Gary wages against the sharks. Here is the expanded, high-impact version of the second part, written strictly in English for your project. The first 48 hours after the demolition were the quietest of my life. In the engineering world, we call this the stabilization period, the critical window immediately following a catastrophic structural failure where you hold your breath and wait to see if the remaining skeleton will settle or if a total collapse is imminent. I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with a heavy-duty tactical flashlight and my laptop, monitoring the perimeter feed. Every time the floorboards groaned, my hand went to my phone, ready to trigger the silent alarm. I had moved a cot into the hallway outside Margaret's bedroom. I was no longer a husband sharing a bed, I was a sentry guarding a vault. Frank arrived on Monday morning at 7 o'clock sharp. He didn't come alone. He brought a locksmith and a high-end security contractor he'd worked with during his decades on the force. They didn't just change the deadbolts. They reinforced the frames with 6-inch hardened steel screws and installed high-impact security film on every ground floor window. It was industrial-grade reinforcement. Frank watched me as I inspected the new strike plates, checking the tolerances with a micrometer. He told me I was building a bunker. I told him I was correcting a design flaw. I had let a wolf through the front door because I was blinded by a father's pride, and I wasn't going to leave so much as a vent open for the rest of the pack. By noon, the house was a fortress. But the internal damage was still leaking. Margaret wouldn't come out of her room. She wasn't angry with me, she was mourning. She was mourning the version of Daniel that had died the moment I pressed play on that footage and showed her the monster we had raised. I brought her tea and toast, sitting on the edge of the bed while she stared at the wall with hollow eyes. She whispered that he was still our son. I looked at her and spoke the hardest truth I've ever uttered. I told her that our son wouldn't have used her heart condition as a bargaining chip. The man who had been living in our basement was a stranger wearing Daniel's skin, a parasite that had finished eating the host. I didn't tell her about the threats Daniel had made on his way out. I didn't tell her about the private lenders. I went down to my office, my war room, and went to work. Daniel had left his old laptop behind in his panicked exit. I'm a civil engineer, not a forensic IT expert, but I spent 30 years tracking down discrepancies in multi-million-dollar blueprints. I know how to follow a trail. I spent 6 hours digging through his cached files, his browser history, and his encrypted chats. What I found was a structural nightmare. Daniel hadn't just lost money, he had developed a high-stakes gambling addiction on the dark web, day trading on margin with money he didn't have. He owed a group out of Tacoma, a private equity firm that was really just a front for professional predatory lending. The total debt was $184,000, and the interest was compounding daily. But the real hit was the collateral. Daniel had given them everything. Our home address, Margaret's social security number, our primary bank account routing numbers. He had sold the deed to our life just to buy himself another week of breathing room. My rage was no longer hot, it was absolute zero. This was a hostile takeover of my estate. I called Patricia at the bank and told her to set up a honeypot, a secondary account with a small balance that would trigger an immediate IP trace and a location alert if anyone attempted a draw. Then I called my attorney. I didn't want a simple divorce-style separation. I wanted a civil theft litigation and a permanent injunction. I wanted to ensure that if Daniel tried to sell so much as a handful of dirt from this property, there would be a legal lien on his very soul. The lenders didn't wait long to test the perimeter. Tuesday night at 11:15 p.m., a black SUV with tinted windows pulled into our cul-de-sac. It didn't park in front of my house. It sat 3 doors down, lights off, engine idling. I watched them on the 4K monitor. 2 men built like professional blockers. They weren't street thugs. They were the kind of people who carry briefcases and legal-looking folders to intimidate the elderly. I didn't call the police. Not yet. I had already prepared the stress test. I walked out onto my porch. I didn't hide. I stood directly under the floodlight, wearing my work jacket and holding a clipboard. I made sure they saw me looking at them, then at my phone, then back at them. I was tagging them, letting them know they were being recorded from 4 different angles. I hit the button on my app, and the 50,000 lumen LED arrays I'd installed that afternoon slammed on, turning the street into high noon. The SUV lurched into gear and sped off, but the message arrived 10 minutes later on my burner phone. It said the debt doesn't leave when the boy does. It said they had the paperwork and they'd see me at the closing. Wednesday morning, I drove to a specialized legal firm in downtown Portland that Frank had recommended. They handled predatory debt defense. I sat across from a man named Elias, who looked like he'd been carved out of flint. I showed him the contracts Daniel had signed, or rather, the forgeries he'd attempted to use as collateral. Elias told me that since Daniel had no legal authority to pledge the home, the contracts were technically worthless. But these people didn't care about technical. They cared about leverage. I told Elias I had my own leverage. I've been a civil engineer in this city for 30 years. I've worked on the sewers, the power grids, and the transit tunnels. I know where the cracks are. I had discovered that the private equity firm in Tacoma was currently trying to get a permit for a massive warehouse development on the waterfront. The lead structural inspector for that district was an old protege of mine. I had spent the previous night reviewing their public blueprints and found a critical flaw. Their foundation plan was built on unstable silt, and they were cutting corners on the pilings. If I filed a formal third-party engineering concern, their multi-million-dollar project would be mothballed for 18 months of retesting. Elias asked if I was going to blackmail them. I told him no. I was going to perform a load redistribution. I met their representative in a quiet coffee shop in Tigard that evening. He was one of the men from the SUV. He slid a folder across the table and told me to sign a home equity line of credit or they would make Margaret's life uncomfortable. I didn't touch the folder. I pulled out my tablet and showed him the waterfront site photos and the notice of structural noncompliance I had drafted, complete with my professional seal. I told him that if I hit send on the final version to the city planning office, his bosses would lose $6 million in construction delays. I told him I also had a brother-in-law handing over their license plates and IP addresses to the Major Crimes Unit. The man's eyes went cold, but I could see the calculation happening. He realized I wasn't a vulnerable adult he could bully. I was the man who knew how to bring the entire building down on his head. I demanded a signed release of all claims against the Vance estate and every piece of data they had on Daniel's debts. He hissed a curse, told me the kid was still out there and would turn up eventually, and walked out. I drove home in the rain. When I walked through the door, the atmospheric pressure in the house felt right again. The external threats were handled. I went upstairs and found Margaret watching the rain. She asked if it was over. I told her the perimeter was secure, but that Daniel was now a ghost we would have to learn to live with. I slept in my own bed that night, but I kept the tablet on the nightstand, the cameras humming in the dark. I knew the structural repair was complete, but as an engineer, I also knew about latent defects. Daniel was still out there, and a man who has lost everything usually has one more desperate, destructive move left in him. I was 63, I had saved my home and my wife, but I knew the final collapse was still coming. I just had to be ready for the impact. The final collapse didn't happen with a bang. It happened with a key turning in a lock that no longer existed. It was a Tuesday, 3 weeks after I had neutralized the Tacoma group. The rain in Portland had turned into a relentless, gray sheets that blurred the lines between the sidewalk and the street. I was in the kitchen making a quiet dinner for Margaret, when the notification on my phone pulsed. Front door, motion detected. Then, the sound of metal scraping against metal. It was the sound of a man trying to use a dead key in a reinforced lock. I didn't call out. I didn't rush. I walked to the hallway monitor and watched. Daniel looked like he had been living in his car. His jacket was stained, his hair was matted, and the chosen smile that had once charmed everyone was replaced by a jagged, desperate twitch. He pounded on the door, his voice muffled by the high-impact glass. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was screaming about his inheritance. He was screaming that I was stealing his life. I watched him on the screen and felt a strange, cold clarity. He was no longer a structural element of this family. He was debris, and debris has to be cleared. I opened the door. I didn't open it wide and I didn't step back. I stood in the breach, the reinforced frame at my back. Daniel lunged forward, but he stopped when he saw the look in my eyes. It wasn't anger. It was the look a demolition expert gives a building that is already scheduled for implosion. I told him he had exactly 60 seconds to turn around before the silent alarm, which was already counting down, notified the precinct. I told him that the private lenders had signed a release, but they had also given me a list of the forgeries he'd used. I told him I had a felony fraud case sitting on my lawyer's desk, ready to be filed the moment he stepped over my threshold. He began to cry then, but it was the tactical crying of a salesman who had lost his lead. He started talking about the debt, about the men who were still looking for him, about how he had nowhere to go. He reached out to grab my arm, and for the first time in my life, I flinched away from my own son as if he were a live wire. "You did this," he hissed, the tears vanishing instantly. "You chose this house over me. You chose your money over your own blood." I looked him dead in the eye and told him that I hadn't chosen money. I had chosen the only person in this world who had never lied to me. I told him that Margaret was upstairs, and she was finally breathing without fear, and I would burn this entire city to the ground before I let him take that from her again. He realized then that the mechanical bastard he'd mocked wasn't a joke. I was a man who understood the limits of materials, and he had pushed me past the yield point. He backed away into the rain, shouting threats that didn't have any weight anymore. He looked small. He looked like a mistake I'd spent 34 years making. I closed the door and heard the heavy click of the electronic deadbolt engaging. It was the most satisfying sound I'd ever heard. It was the sound of a completed project. I went upstairs to Margaret. She was standing at the top of the stairs, her hands gripping the railing. She had heard it all. I expected her to be broken, to ask me to go after him, to beg for one more chance. But she just looked at the door, then at me. She asked if he was gone. I told her he was. She walked over to me, her movements slow but steady, and she leaned her head against my shoulder. We stood there for a long time in the silence of a house that was finally ours again. The aftermath was a series of legal filings and quiet nights. Daniel was picked up 2 counties over a month later for an unrelated fraud attempt at a rental agency. I didn't bail him out. I didn't call. I sent his belongings to the public defender's office in a single crate, along with a letter stating that all future communication would go through my attorney. It was the final notice of condemnation. People ask me sometimes, the few who know the story, how I could be so cold to my own blood. I tell them the same thing I told the junior engineers for 30 years. You can't save a structure if the core is compromised. If you try to patch over rot, the whole thing eventually falls and kills everyone inside. Margaret is doing better. Her blood pressure has stabilized and she started gardening again in the backyard, within the line of sight of the new cameras. She still cooks too much food, but now it goes to the neighbors or the local shelter. She still apologizes if she bumps into me, but she doesn't flinch when the phone rings anymore. I still work as a consultant 3 days a week. It keeps my mind sharp, and it pays for the high-end monitoring service that watches our perimeter while we sleep. I'm 63 years old. I spent my career building things that were meant to last forever, but I've learned that the most important work I've ever done was the demolition. My home is a fortress, my wife is safe, and the door is locked from the inside. I still love the memory of the boy I thought I had, but I've made my peace with the fact that the memory was a blueprint for a building that was never actually built. I sit on my porch in the evenings now, watching the Portland fog roll in, a civil engineer who finally finished his own house. The foundation is scarred and the layout has changed, but the structure is sound. And this time I'm the only one with the keys.